We're continuing on. We're actually going to finish the Gospel of John. I'm sure it's always a little sad but exciting because then there's a whole new book to study, and we're going to be getting into some new series in this next fall. But today's this ending of John is a little strange. When you read through the Gospel, when you finish the last chapter, you thought this is over, and then there's another chapter. And a lot of scholars have argued over what happened there. You get the feeling, and I guess we don't know, but I get the sense that I think John wrote the last chapter, 20, and probably died or was arrested or taken away. And when his fellow church members, fellow elders, whatever, came in, they found a few extra writings that weren't necessarily a part of the original gospel. Or at least they weren't, John hadn't put them in yet. And so this last chapter is almost like they found this story that they'd heard John tell hundreds and hundreds of times. And so they just sort of stuck it on the end of what he had already written. The fact is, textually, the Gospel of John has never been found in any form that didn't have this last chapter on it. So whatever happened, it was always there from the first time it was starting to be distributed. So we have high confidence that this was, in fact, John's writing. It just seems a little strange right here at the end. But it's also a story that makes sense. And of course, John is the only one that recorded this last section. So we're in John chapter 21, entitled Gone Fishing. There we go. Al did a great job with these pictures, too. It's awesome. After Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, and most of you know that means a twin. He was a twin. Nathanael of Cana from Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee. And two other disciples were there together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." That's not surprising, since that's what they'd been doing when Jesus picked them up in the first place. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, have you got any fish?" Normal question. "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." Boy, this is starting to sound a little familiar, isn't it? When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire burning, and coals there with fish on it already. "Bring some of the fish and some bread." Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come, have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. You know, I've often thought, if we didn't have bread and wine for communion, that the next Christian meal of choice would be bread and fish. I mean, it just shows up all through Jesus' gospel. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these?" Now, I think a lot of times we miss this, but that's a strange question. It's one thing to say, "Do you love me?" But Jesus is sitting here with these other disciples, James and John and Thomas, and he says, "Do you love me, more than these guys?" It's a little strange, a little awkward maybe. Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you would dress yourself and went where you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. You need to understand, by the time John's writing this, Peter's been dead 30 years or so. And everyone knew he was crucified. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? Now you can imagine John looking around at 95 or so and realizing he was the last apostle still alive, why those rumors might have carried on like they did. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know, and again, we don't know who we know is. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So we have this very sort of added story or additional story seeming right here at the end, but it's a very personal story. It's about an encounter with Jesus fishing. It seems to be something very, very mundane even. Everybody fished around there. They had always been fishing. It's hard to know what exactly the significance of the story is until you get to where Jesus is talking to Peter. And it's a very interesting exchange. I mean, these guys, here's Jesus been resurrected. He's appeared a couple times. They go back to Galilee, and they just don't know what to do. So, what do you do when you don't know what to do? You do what you always did. And they went fishing. What's the Christian significance of fishing? When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, this is the first story, in case you couldn't quite remember it. When he finished speaking, he turned to Simon and said, put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon answered, Master, we have worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. And they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man. Now again, we might recognize a sign of respect, but what we need to appreciate, if you go through the Old Testament, you're familiar with the Old Testament scriptures, when a human being came into contact with the divine, this is how they responded. They recognized God, and there was this sort of rumor that if you ever saw God or an angel or whatever, you could die. And so Jesus is recognized. Peter, this is the first time where Peter recognized. He thought he was a good teacher, he was a good rabbi, liked his words. liked following him, but when he saw this, he recognized, I am in the presence of the divine. He said, go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man. Then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. So they pulled their boats up on shore and left everything and followed him. Are you seeing the similarities in the stories? I mean, this one in John 21 is not coincidental in their comparisons. Now, the first story, the nets were tearing, and the boats actually began to sink as a result of such a large catch. But in John 21, the catch is large, but the nets aren't breaking. Again, encountering the divine. The first story, Jesus told Peter that he would be catching people and not fish from that point forward. And here in this story in John, that ministry, that very ministry that he alluded to earlier, is about to begin in a big way. He and all of his fellow disciples. Now, what's the deal with Peter and 3 times? Something about that number seems to ring with Peter. And we read this thing about right before Jesus predicts they will all turn away. Jesus said to them, again, all of you will turn against me this very night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. However, after I have been raised, I will go to Galilee ahead of you. But Peter said to him, even if everyone else turns against you, I certainly won't. I mean, I'm not too sure about these guys, Jesus, but, I'm in. That was pretty arrogant statement. And Jesus said, truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter told him, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. And all the other disciples said the same thing. But of course, we know the rest of that story. So I have a feeling, after 3 denials, Jesus recognizes that Peter needs to work back through this. That he needs to reaffirm his love in the same manner that he denied he was a follower of Jesus. So Jesus says, when they finished eating, Jesus said to him, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? And I don't know, but I think he's referring back to that, even if the rest of these guys deny you, I won't. And so I think Jesus is deliberately sort of falling back into that. Do you love me more than these? You still feel the way you used to? And of course we know there's this play on words in here. In Greek it's more obvious. In English it just translates love, but Jesus literally tells Peter, do you agape me? And Peter's response is, Lord, you know that I phileo you. One is the all-encompassing love, the unconditional love, whereas the other is a brotherly love. Both very powerful, both very intimate. But it's an interesting shift of the words as they go back and forth. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of Jonah, do you truly agape me? And Peter's response is, you know that I phileo, brotherly love you. And then the 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you, and this is interesting, he says, phileo. He changes to Peter's word. Do you phileo me? And Peter was hurt because he'd asked him a 3rd time. But again, I think the 3 is significant. He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus' response is also interesting, because it's not just a sort of a, do you love me? Sure. And then they go on. You see, when Jesus says, do you love me, he's expecting some sort of actionable response. It's not enough to just say, I love Jesus, if your life doesn't show it. We've often talked about that quote from Francis of Assisi where he says, it's very important to preach everywhere you go, and when necessary, use words. That there's something about our lives, something about the way we treat each other, something about the way we handle our finances, something about the way we just engage in our daily relationships, interchanges with our workers, our bosses, our people that work under us, our neighbors. There's something about the way we just behave that shows we love Jesus, way before we say, I love Jesus. So when Peter is in this situation, Jesus keeps saying, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep. You know, these guys that you were looking down on? You know, these guys that you were comparing yourself to? And obviously comparing yourself in a superior way to them. These other guys that you weren't too sure about, that you didn't have any confidence in. If you love me, feed my sheep. All of them. Whether you look down on them or up at them or whatever, you need to change the way you look at them because they're my sheep. And if you want to prove you love me, you're going to feed them. Because that's who I care about. And so you're going to have to not just care about me, you're going to have to care about what I care about. And focus on what I'm focusing on. Feed my sheep. Jesus indicates the nature of the apostles' ministry is to be shepherding. It's a shepherding ministry. And that says a lot in how church leadership is supposed to take care of sheep. The only thing that bothers me is, and maybe they weren't aware of this at the time, but sheep are some of the dumbest animals in the world. Then again, maybe they were aware of that. But the idea is that you're going to have to take care of sheep. Sheep don't know how to, all they know how to do is hang together, and even then they can be scattered easily. And every now and then they'll find, a sheep that's kind of smarter than the others, and so they stick a bell on it so everybody will follow him. Only problem is if he happens to trip and walk off a cliff, the whole herd will walk off with him. They just aren't that bright. They need to be taken care of. And so when Jesus tells him, feed my sheep, he's saying they need to be taken care of. And this image is common throughout the Old Testament. God is often portrayed as the shepherd of Israel. There's that passage in Ezekiel 34 where the prophecy is made clearly about Jesus, that the good shepherd will come. And God's rebuking the shepherds of Israel. He's saying, if you won't do it, then I will come personally and take care of my sheep. I'm going to send my own personal good shepherd, indicating the Christ to come. That this image is common throughout Scripture and right into the New Testament. And Jesus is often portrayed as a shepherd in early Christian art. And apparently Peter gets this. I mean, Peter's a little slow sometimes. He's a little, puts his mouth in gear before he puts his mind in motion kind of guy. But somewhere along the way, he got it. And as he writes towards the end of his life, very close to the end of his life in Rome, he writes, therefore, as a fellow elder, a witness of Christ's suffering, and one who shares in the glory to be revealed, I appeal to the elders among you. Be shepherds of God's flock that is among you, watching over it. Do not lord it over the people entrusted to you, but be examples to the flock. Then, when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the victor's crown of glory that will never fade away. And it's a way of him reminding, Peter's figured out who the chief shepherd is. And if you're going to be a shepherd of the church, you need to always remember. See, a lot of times shepherds can sort of forget. They think, we're the big dogs. We're the ones that get to make the decisions. We're the top of the food chain. And Peter's reminded them, no, you got to always, when you're a shepherd, you got to always remember there's a chief shepherd. And when we get to the end, we're going to have to talk to him about the kind of shepherding we did. And he makes it very clear. Don't make the worldly misunderstanding that as a shepherd you get to sort of lord it over. You get to, carry the big stick and make all the decisions and throw your authority around. That's not what Christian shepherding is all about. Christian shepherding is about getting the sheep to follow you. If you have a shepherd And I don't know, we're kind of removed from herding animals and this kind of thing. But if you understand sheep at all, if the shepherd walks around kicking and hitting the sheep with his staff, and if he walks around yelling and screaming at them, they don't follow him. You see, the reason the sheep follow the shepherd is because they're convinced he actually cares about them. They know his voice. He speaks softly to them. He sings songs to them. And when he takes off walking, they go with him because they know he's concerned for them. And that's what Christian shepherding is supposed to be about. And then there's this little section, and I think we really missed this. This is something I want to pull over and park on for just a second here. When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" As a minister, I've heard this a lot. What about him? What about her? And Jesus says, look, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. He talks about because of this, the rumor spread he wouldn't die, but that's not what he said. But we need to get this. Do you ever compare yourself to other people? Please don't raise your hands. No need to. I won't even ask you to repent because you might as well just all stay seated. All right? The fact is, we do that. It's a human nature thing. You catch yourself saying, why can't I have their gift, their talent, their good looks, their good health, their job, their income? Why didn't I have their parents? Why can't I have their kids? We do all these comparisons. And we need to understand what Jesus said. You know, Peter's a little nervous. Jesus told him, you're gonna be crucified. And he knows, you know, little Johnny back here was Jesus' favorite little pet. That John was the youngest disciple. He always got to sit next to Jesus. And he even walked around telling people, you know, I'm the one Jesus loved. And Peter's a little, you know, okay, I'm going to get crucified. What about him? You know, is something nasty going to happen to him too? I mean, am I the only one out here? You know. Jesus says, if I want him to remain until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. God has called each one of us to follow him in the way that he intended. He created each one of us to become the people he had in mind. And if we walk around comparing, how come they get this and we don't get that? And that's because that's not what God called you for. And I know as a minister I do that. You know, I've talked about how, you know, I have been listening to Jeff Walling preach since I was 13. I think the first time I saw him, I was 13. And he was just always good. He was always not just good, he was awesome. And I can remember just thinking, boy, I wish I could preach like that. I wish I could be like Jeff. I wish I could. And I realized, you know what? God didn't call me to be Jeff Walling. He called me to be Daniel Jolliff. That each one of us are called to do our part. Big part, small part, doesn't matter. We had a drama group once, and we illustrated this point by people, you know, showing up. If you became new Christians, pick up your cross at the counter. And we had this big sign. And so the Christians would come up, and there was this big monster guy in our group, 6'4", really huge, on the wrestling team, football team, everything. And he shows up, and they hand him a little tiny cross. He's like, I don't want any sissy little cross. I want to give me a big cross, you know. And they're like, well, no, this is the cross God gave you. And then this petite little cute girl shows up, and they pull out this monster cross. You know. She's like, I can't handle that. And they said, don't worry, God will help you with it. You know. But we need, you know, it was illustrating the point that God calls us to our ministry, and we can't get fixated on, well, that's not the ministry I wanted. I wanted those gifts, not my gifts. I wanted those things, not my things. And he's look, Peter, I've got a job for you to do. You need to follow me. And you know what? I've got a job for John. And he's going to follow me too. And what his job is and what your job is doesn't matter. You do your job, and you let me take care of John. God's called each one of us to a ministry. He's called each one of us to contribute, not just money to the church, but our gifts and our talents, our work for the church. He's called each one of us to spread the gospel in our own way. Some people are incredibly gifted evangelists, and some people aren't. But some people are just good at baking cookies and giving them to the neighbors. Some people are good at just stopping by and seeing someone that needs help and picking it up. Some people just, reach out in easy ways. Some people don't. But whatever your gift is, do that gift. Do what God has called you to do. And if you're sitting here thinking, I have no idea what God called me to do, then please come talk to me. If we can't figure it out, I don't know what. But, we're going to figure it out. God has called each one of us with gifts and talents and natural things and people we know. I remember when we went to Mombasa, and as missionaries, you go in and you think, we're going to save the whole city. And then you realize, there's like 750,000 people in Mombasa. And, maybe we should just pick on half of it, It was kind of broken up. There was the island, there was the North Mainland, the South Mainland, and the East Mainland. Maybe we should just pick on one of those. And you finally realize, maybe we need to just sort of focus on this neighborhood. We had to kind of, trim our visions of grandeur down to the vision God had given us. That we realize, this is God's work. This is what God does. And my input, this is really important. We talk about how God has given us all free will. And that's true. But there's we have this idea that we have unlimited free will, and that's not true. See, our free will is actually very, very limited. God has a job to do. God has a mission that he is working through the world on his timetable. And our free will extends right up to, am I going to join God or not? That's it. Are we going to do what God's called us to do or not? And even if the answer is not, God's going to do it anyway. The key will be, are we on his team or not on his team? Jesus is telling Peter, do the job that God gives you. Just do your job. And don't worry about everybody else. Do your job. Do what I have called you to do. And we'll let John take care of what God's called John to do. There's no way to finish John, at least as far as I'm concerned, without going back to the beginning. So let's read it together. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believe in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. It's a little song. You may have heard it before, but it just sort of brings this lesson home to me, but it just goes like this. Behold what manner of love the Father has given unto us. Behold what manner of love the Father has given unto us, that we may be called the children of God. that we may be called the children of God. Behold, what manner of love the Father has given unto us. Behold, what manner of love the Father has given unto us, that we may be called the children of God. That we may be called the children of God. I hope that helps you remember the lesson. John presented them and us, a first-person eyewitness account of the ministry of Jesus Christ in a very different way than the other Gospels did. Very intimate way. And his whole point, and one of the things I get a kick out of John, I was talking with Larry about this last week, but John's interesting, and the other Gospels just sort of tell the story of Jesus. John keeps inserting himself in this. And not with just, the disciple that Jesus loved, but he keeps saying, I'm writing this to you because. The reason I'm saying this is so that John keeps letting the early church know, and he's letting us know. There's a purpose in you don't just tell the story. I'm writing this so that you will believe in the name of the Son of God and have life in his name. And the fact of the matter is, the Word became flesh and continues in the flesh because the church is the body of Christ. That we continue to display Jesus, or at least that's what our job is supposed to be. One of our missions is supposed to be that we display Jesus in the world. So that when people see us, our greatest hope, our greatest prayer is that people won't see us. They'll see Jesus in us. Have you seen Jesus lately? I hope so. And if you haven't committed your life to Jesus, you need to do so. And again, I'd love to talk to you about that. But whatever your needs are this morning, please come as we stand and sing.